All right, section 4.4, day 2. We're going to be doing proofs today. So when doing proofs, it is important to draw the figure if the drawing is not provided, label the drawing from the given information with congruent parts, and analyze the drawing as how to do the proof. So let's dive in. So here we have the image of the triangle. We don't have our given information written down. Let me get that written down. So in this, we are told Z is the midpoint of BC. Z is the midpoint of side BC. And also, side AB is congruent to AC. So that's our given information. So we know AB is congruent to AC. And we know Z is the midpoint of BC. So then down on our statements, we can write Z is the midpoint of BC. And we know that's given. And then we were also told AB is equal to AC or congruent to AC. And that was given. So how can we come to another conclusion, make another statement off of what we have? Well, if Z is the midpoint of BC, that tells me that BZ is congruent to ZC or CZ. So BZ is congruent to CZ, and that is because the definition of a midpoint. Definition of a midpoint. Then our fourth statement, now looking at our picture, what else can we conclude from what we see here? Hopefully you notice that these two triangles share a side. So if they share that side, that means AZ is congruent to AZ. And that's because of the reflexive property. Anytime you have that shared side, that's because of the reflexive property. And then our fifth and final statement is what we need to prove. Now, I didn't write it up here. I should have done that first. We were also supposed to prove these two triangles together, and we have the congruent statement, triangle ABZ, congruent to triangle ACZ. So that's what we need to prove, so we can write that down in our statement. Triangle ABZ congruent, triangle ACZ, because, and we use the side postulate. 3 sides congruent of those two triangles. All right, our second proof. You need to write down the given and information and the congruent statement that we need to prove. So our given information is that Bn is congruent to Cn and Zn is congruent to Yn. And we want to prove triangle BNY congruent to triangle CNZ. So that's what we need to prove. We want to mark our image BN congruent to CN. So BN and CN are congruent. And we know Zn and Yn are congruent. Zn and Yn are congruent. So let's go ahead and get that down in our statements. Bn congruent to Cn. Which was given. Zn congruent to Yn. That was also given. And then we got to come up with something else here. So I don't see any way to show that BY and ZC are congruent, so we're not going to be using side, side, side. But we do have some vertical angles here. So since those angles are vertical, those angles are congruent. So we need to name those angles, and we'll have to use 3 letters. Since both angles share that vertex of N, we've got to be specific about which angle we're talking about. So we have angle BNY. Is congruent to angle CNZ. And it's because vertical angles. Vertical angles congruence here. And then our fourth and final statement is what we're proving. So we need to prove triangle BNY congruent to triangle CNZ. And we're able to prove those because of the side angle side. We've got a side or 2 sides that are congruent, and the angle is included in those 2 sides. They're all right next to each other, all together. Side, angle, side. And then our last proof, last example for today, our given information, let's write that in. Y is the midpoint of segment XZ. And let's see, XV is congruent to ZW. XV is congruent to ZW. And XV is parallel to ZW. So we've actually got three different given information here. And we're going to try and prove that triangle XVY is congruent to triangle ZWY. Okay, let's put in our information on our two triangles on our image. Y is the midpoint of XZ. We know Y is a midpoint here. We know that XV and ZW are congruent. XV and ZW are congruent. And we know XV and ZW are parallel. So put in those arrows as well. Show that they're parallel. Okay, so we can fill in our given information. Y is the midpoint of XZ. That was given to us. We know XV is congruent to ZW. That was given to us. We know XV is parallel to ZW. Those two vertical lines side by side means parallel. And that was given. All right, now we need to be able to use that given information to get us to the next step. Well, we know Y is the midpoint of XZ. So that tells me XY and ZY are congruent. It splits that segment in two equal parts because it's the midpoint. So we've got two congruent sides. Is there any way we can show, we're looking for any way we can show that the angle there and the angle there are congruent? Let's go ahead and put in that information we just wrote or marked on our image. XY congruent to ZY. And that was the definition of midpoint. So now back to what I was asking about. Is there any way we can show that the angle there at X and the angle there at Z are congruent? We know that those two lines there, XV and ZW, are parallel. So if we imagine those going on forever as our parallel lines, and then XZ being our transversal, we would see that they're alternate interior angles. So angle X and angle Z are congruent because of alternate interior angles. Alternate interior angles. And then we need to prove that final statement up there, that congruent statement. Triangle XVY congruent congruent to triangle ZWY. And those are congruent. If we look back at our image, we've got two sides and angle in between those two sides, showing that they're congruent by side, angle side. And we could not use the vertical angles because that would have spelled out ASS. That would have been bad, right? We need that angle in between the two sides. We weren't told that VY and WY were congruent, so we couldn't assume that. We needed to go off of what we had. So we couldn't use those vertical angles to help us prove this. We had to find those alternate interior angles. All right, that's it for the notes today. Make sure you do your 4.4 day 2 homework.